POGO session.
This meeting is being recorded.
You will have just heard the robot voice telling you that this meeting is being recorded, as it always is. So we've got a really exciting session for you today, focusing on VCSEs. We have a report from Tussell and we have a great panel for you. And we are very privileged to have Claire Dove with us, who's going to chair most of today's session. Claire is the Crown representative for VCSEs. And we're hugely excited, Claire, to have you with us and to have your input today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the session and to introduce Gus.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I hope this, I know this is going to be a very interesting debate that we're going to have. And I think it's very applicable. It's 10 years now since the social value went onto our statute books. And it's been an interesting ride of how it's changed and how it started to have that impact and draw us into making our contracts much more diverse, having much more diverse organizations as part of that. We've still got a long way to go, but it's the last couple of years, things have really changed. So I'm really pleased about this afternoon that we can have that robust discussion. It's we haven't got a lot of time, but hopefully we will touch on social value. We will look at other countries and what they're doing. So we've got some great speakers from outside of the UK, because that's always good to hear what's happening in other places. But also, you know, to share some of the data that we have on what is happening here in the UK. So I'm going to go straight into our first presenter today, which is Gus from Tussell. And as Anne just said, Tussell they finished a piece of research on behalf of DCMS on how many contracts were going to the VCSE sector. It's very different for the SME sector in government. They're very much more established in government procurement, as with the apart from the VCSEs, but we are starting to make those inroads. So hopefully Gus is on the line and I can hand over to him for the presentation.
I am on the line, and thank you very much, Claire. And it's good to see you again, albeit in a tiny little tile. It's a few years since we met in person. My name's Gus Tuggenhe. I'm the founder of Tussell. Tussell is a data provider, and we were commissioned by DCMS to analyse the value of UK government contracts spent with VCSEs. So I'm delighted to have been invited by Rory and the team at, is it POGO, do I call it, to attend this event. I've been given about 5 minutes, so I was just going to set off my my timer to keep within that. And I was just going to try and give you my take on what I thought kind of jumped out to us as the kind of authors of this report. We do quite a quantitative analysis. We're not here to kind of form opinions. We're just the folk who wrangle the data and kind of share a few insights as to what it tells us. But I will kind of tell you what it means to me, what I think is significant, and hopefully that will tee up a bit of discussion for afterwards. So I'm not going to share my screen. I'm not going to go through the report in detail. It's about 80 pages long. It's full of whizzy kind of charts and things. It's been posted online. Everybody will have seen it in the invite to this event. Sorry, I've got a stinking head cold, so excuse me if I suddenly reach for water or something. And Andrew has helpfully just posted a link to the report. So there's not enough time to kind of do it justice in detail. So I'll just kind of take you through 5 or 6 observations that I think kind of are in the data, and then kind of 3 or 4 kind of things that it kind of really says to me, or areas of improvement based on the data. So what does the report tell us? Kind of a few of the really positive things to come out of the report. First off, about 12,500 VCSEs provided services directly to the UK public sector in the 5-year period covered by the report. So that's 12,500. That's a lot of VCSEs that benefited from kind of working directly with the government. Over that period, they won about 5% of all wider public sector contracts awarded to anybody. So large companies, SMEs, VCSEs, they got a 5% market share. So that was roughly £17 billion worth of value that went to charities and non-profits who were delivering those services with more than purely economic benefit in mind. Most of those contracts, unsurprisingly, were providing what we would call people-based services, in particular around health and social care. In particular areas like tackling homelessness and domestic abuse. As you would expect, local government is better at awarding contracts to VCSEs than any other part of government, which I think kind of reflects the fact that local government is involved in more of those people-based services and is just generally kind of closer to the grassroots. So you'd kind of expect that. Fifth, most contracts awarded to VCSEs were local. So not only were they awarded to a VCSE, which I think is a good thing in itself, but in more than 50% of the cases, they were awarded to a VCSE, which was in the same region as the public body awarding the contract to them. So there's a kind of double, a double win there. It's both local and with more social impact. And finally, nearly 2/3 of the spend with those VCSEs went to the long tail of smaller organizations. So it's not like some parts of the public sector where 80% of the value is going to 20% of the providers. 66% of the value was going to the long tail there. So it's quite diversified, it's quite disaggregated. So those are all the good things to come out of the report for us. And it confirms to me that VCSEs are already an integral part of the government's supply chain, where they're active in delivering social benefits and in delivering services with more than purely economic benefits in mind. However, it's part of my role to point out kind of where there is room for improvement and some of the more kind of awkward things that the data tells us. So with that in mind, just kind of, 3 or 4 things that jumped out to me about, about what the data tells us could be improved upon. Number one, less than 10% of VCSEs are directly involved in the public sector. So whilst 12,500 of them won an award, which is great, there's more than 160,000 charities in the UK, many more than that when you include all the social enterprises and all the different types of non-profit. So why is only less than 10% of those entities winning public sector contracts directly? I should qualify that many more might be winning helping to deliver public sector contracts indirectly. So as secondary or tertiary players in the supply chain, delivering services to a prime contractor. But the fact remains that less than 10% of the in-scope organisations are currently working directly with the public sector. So what could we do to draw those other 90% plus into the direct supply chain? Secondly, only 44% of the VCSEs that won a government contract, only one of them. So, you know, there's no kind of repeat business. So why are nearly half delivering one contract, but apparently not more? It suggests that either they weren't the right provider or the public body wasn't the right customer for them. But we're looking for repeatability, for, you know, for a kind of sustainable relationship, and it kind of jumped out at me that 44% delivered once and then did something else. That looks like a bit of a red flag. Even within health and social services, 75% of the contracts still go to non-VCSEs. So could the public sector, through procurement reforms and other means, be doing more to work with VCSEs in the sectors where, you know, where they are really competitive or you know, or better than the private sector alternatives? Fourth, and this is my penultimate point, the median size of contracts won by VCSEs is still small. It's less than 100,000. It's below the threshold, to use the kind of procurement lingo. So how could VCSEs kind of win bigger tickets? How could they be given bigger contracts with which to, you know, to effect more change? And then finally, I would just point out the difficulty we had in producing the report, that it's actually quite difficult to generate a list of social enterprises, kind of that there isn't a kind of equivalent of the Charity Commission where you can just go and scrape a list of them. So we almost certainly didn't capture all of them. And if it was that hard for us to accurately analyze what is happening to that group of companies, how difficult is it for the public bodies to engage with them in order to kind of bring them into their supply chain? So that's it. I slightly exceeded my 5 minutes, but not by too long. I hope I've shared a few insights as to what we think is going quite well, and a few kind of, you know, clues as to what the data tells us, you know, are opportunities to make the system work even better. I'll be around, happy to answer questions now or later, but I'll give it back to you, Claire.
Thanks very much indeed, Gus, for that. The sort of cusp of that report, some of the main issues, and obviously what Gus has put there is the contract in between central government and local government, which is very different in the sense of what we're able to do in central government as opposed to local government, and having the freedom to procure from a wide range of people. So, but I'm not going to get into it. I have so many questions I want to put to you, Gus, but another time. But I want to bring in our panel now. And because what we want to sort of explore now is why shouldn't government engage with voluntary charities and social enterprises and in their public procurement? And really, it's to look at the benefits. Are there the benefits to actually supporting them? And do you have any examples of good practice from your countries where you are that have supported the sector, but also as a result of that being able to make an impact in the communities that we're all there to serve? So with that question, I'm going to go to Dr. Abby Semple in the first to give her analysis of what's happening. So Abby, over to you.
Okay, Thanks very much, Claire, and thank you, Gus, for that report, which is really, really brilliant to see those findings. And I think following the discussion in the chat a bit, I think there's people are actually relatively impressed about the size of that spend. And I think there, we can say that there has been a concerted effort in the UK over the last number of years, particularly within the local authority sector, to work with VCSEs. And I think we can see some of that coming through in these figures, while still taking on board the limitations that you cited in terms of the data, and obviously the scope to do more as well.
Oh dear.
So I'm a consultant. I work with public sector bodies in different European countries.
Abby, we're having problems. You're starting to freeze. Would you like to?
Okay.
Shall I go to the next speaker, and if you could come go out and come back in again, maybe it'll stabilize.
Okay, it looks like my internet connection is stable now. Am I still freezing?
No.
Okay. Shall I try and go on? I'm going. Yeah. I'm okay. And do let me know if it is freezing again. Sorry about that. So I was just saying that from the European perspective, I think the first thing to note is that I'm not aware of any similar piece of research giving us a quantification of what percentage of contracts are being awarded to VCSEs. The term VCSEs isn't broadly used across Europe. We have a sort of selection of different phrases that get used, sometimes social enterprises. In Spain and Italy, we often hear about work integration, social enterprises, and various other terms that get used. So it's not something which has been comprehensively mapped as far as I'm aware. But there has been obviously a lot of work going on in this area within Europe, and different approaches taken. And I think the first thing to note is that within the framework of the European directives, there are sort of two main approaches to working with this sector. And the first, I suppose, is through the use of reservations or designating particular contracts, which can only be bid for by enterprises which have a particular makeup or which employ a certain number of disabled or disadvantaged workers. And that approach has existed in Europe for a long time. It is used in certain member states. However, I think we can say overall it is underused. So you don't see a huge volume of contracts being awarded in this way. But the broader approach, which is used extensively, is not through sort of the who, so not sort of designating a contract for a particular type of organization to bid for, but in terms of how you define a contract, how you set your selection and award criteria, how you define the outcomes that you want for that contract. That approach, broadly known as sort of socially responsible public procurement, is very widespread within Europe. And indeed, in countries such as the Netherlands or France, we have laws specifically supporting this. So in the Netherlands, they have a law relating to social return on investment. In France, they have a law on the social and solidarity economy, both of which support this type of use of procurement. So definitely different approaches.
Abby, I'm sorry, we're really running over. I hate to stop you in your prime, but we can come back to some of those examples,
Okay.
Especially the reserved contracts, which is something that we've now got in the UK government, where we've done reservations on contracts. But I'd like to now go to Nadita Das, who's coming into us from New South Wales. So Nadita, do you want to say your few opening words, please?
Thank you. I am Nandita. I work in the Department of Planning and Environment with the New South Wales Government in Australia. And I'm happy to be the part of the panel and talk about the social procurement of New South Wales Government. And I would like to share some slides. I hope everyone can see it.
Yes, they're fine.
Just to start with some key figures, the New South Wales government spends approximately about 30 to 40 billion dollars per year on the procurement of goods and services, and there are about 600,000 SMEs in New South Wales. SMEs, they include but not limited to Aboriginal businesses, social enterprise, and disability employment organizations. And generally in a policy, the SMEs are defined as an Australian and New Zealand based enterprise with fewer than 200 full-time equivalence employees, and a small business can have 1 to 19 FTEs, which would include sole traders and startups, and a medium enterprise or business is with 20 to 200 full-time equivalents. Now, in terms of the policy, which can be enablers in terms of increasing opportunities for small and medium enterprises, which to drive innovation and capability for local businesses, there are 3 key policy directions as per the New South Wales government. One of which is the SME and the regional policy. The other one is the Aboriginal procurement policy. And the third one is enforcement procurement provisions. And out of these 3, the SME regional policy and the Aboriginal procurement policies are really effective in increasing the participation and engagement of SMEs, and particularly the focus for New South Wales government is on the Aboriginal business. Now, in terms of the key highlights of the policies is like in terms of a single source or a direct negotiation, an agency can actually engage a small or a medium enterprise if the financial threshold is between 10 to 150K, and for Aboriginal business, if it is up to 250K. So as per the small business exemption, the agencies are allowed to purchase goods and services directly from the small business as well as the Aboriginal business. And so in terms of my take on this policy is about thinking outside the square when in terms of procuring and encouraging more direct contracts. I think that's something the New South Wales government is trying to push, is also the direct contracts and giving SMEs a chance. Also, the agencies sometimes get into the habit of going to the same suppliers as they are risk averse, and to break that cycle that if you have to purchase a low value, low risk project, then you have to think about a small business or an Aboriginal business. Sometimes it's just important to give an SME or an Aboriginal business an opportunity to bid. They might not win the work for the best value for money in comparison to other suppliers, but the participation and feedback go a long way to improving their business and developing capability. Now, in terms of, there's another criteria of another policy objectives in terms of SME and sustainability criteria. For all procurements which are valued above 3 million, the New South Wales government agency must include a 15% non-price evaluation criteria as a minimum, which should include a 10% allocated to SME participation and 5% allocated to the support for New South Wales government economic, ethical, and social and environmental priorities. And as per this policy objective, where no weightings are used, SME participation and support for the New South Wales government economic, ethical, environmental, and social priorities should be given appropriate qualitative consideration. And also there is a minimum requirement of 1.5% Aboriginal participation in all contracts, which are 7.5 million or above. And every agency, every supplier has to submit an Aboriginal participation strategy and participation plan, and there has to be a monitoring and a reporting on these commitments, which are made to address the sustainability criteria, including monthly reporting on SMEs that have been engaged. There is also a policy of faster payment, which is about 5 day to pay policy on government invoices that are under up to 1 million and immediate payment up to 10K. So this has really had made a lot of difference in terms of providing invoicing and providing payments quickly to the SMEs. New South Wales government has also a lot of a suite of online resources and tools for standardized contracts arrangement. There are invoicing and e-tendering processes by New South Wales, which is aimed to connect the SMEs with government buyers. There's dispute resolution via the New South Wales Small Business Commission, supplier feedback tool, and also procurement advice from Business Connect, enhancing pre and post tender briefings and feedback. However, my take on having so many policies, resources, and tools, however, the issue is there are clearly not enough businesses or awareness of it to meet the targets and effectiveness of the APP, which is the Aboriginal Procurement Policy or SMEs procurement policies. It's more like the policies really act as like you invite the SMEs and the Aboriginal business to the party, but you are not included to dance and drink. So there are not enough diversified APP suppliers to meet the criteria. And in order to address that, the New South Wales government have launched a concierge service to specifically help the SMEs and the Aboriginal business to understand and to get a greater access to the government procurement opportunities. And there is also something that at the moment has been encouraged in the New South Wales context is the meet the buyer at regional places where the Aboriginal and the small enterprises have the opportunities to meet directly with the New South Wales government's buyers. They have been, so the concierge service really look at the Aboriginal and SMEs sources from Supply Nation, Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, the Industry Capability Network, Small Business Commissioner, and over 1,000 SMEs and Aboriginal businesses were contacted since 2020, since the launch of the concierge service. So, I mean, my penultimate point is diversification of suppliers is essential along with awareness, and social procurement is something that should be embedded in our day-to-day business practices. That's all. Thanks.
Nandita, thank you so much. You put a lot of, you packed a lot into that. So thank you. So if we can move on now to Alison Anthony from the University of South Africa.
Morning, everyone. As Claire just said, I'm Alison Anthony from the University of South Africa, and I'll be talking from a South African perspective. In South Africa, we don't use the terminology VCSEs, but the focus on social procurement has been quite a large one in South Africa. We have specific legislation that focuses on the promotion of procurement from a social perspective. In the first instance, we have the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, and also something that's called the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act. There have been specific industries, or rather specific categories of persons and contractors that may be preferred, such as women, Black-owned businesses, people with disabilities, people from rural areas or townships, and also military veterans. But the focus has largely been on small businesses in South Africa. The PPPFA works based on a point system, in terms of which there are 2 points during the procurement system at which marks, or rather points, are given to a contractor for either being Black-owned, women, having disabilities, or being military veterans, or subcontracting. So the legislation provides that at least 30% of your contract value needs to be subcontracted to a smaller business. You also can be awarded extra points where you are involved in contractor development programs. Specifically in our construction industry, there are quite a few contractor development programs. The construction industry, interestingly, was actually the industry used as the guinea pig, if I can put it that way, used in 1994 when South Africa became a democracy. And at the same time, we also started changing our procurement laws, and entire transformation of our procurement system. And the construction industry was used as a baseline, or the test industry. So many other industries have followed from them. At the moment, they still have most of our contractor development programs, although the statistics show that between 6 and 7% of contracts or procurement contracts in the industry are awarded to the small contractors. which is not nearly enough. There are many programs aimed at their development and also the obligation of subcontracting. The problem we have in South Africa is that this was the case up until February this year, when our Constitutional Court actually declared this legislation to be unconstitutional. The problem we have now is that there's no legislation that is that's making the point system, or that gives detail, a little bit more flesh as to how to implement the point system. So the main act, the Preferential Procurement Framework Act, the PPPFA as we call it, is the one that prescribes the point system, and the regulations flesh out what those points should be awarded for. And some of these are obviously your social objectives, women, disability, small businesses, etc. And that is the law that's now been struck down by our Constitutional Court. So we are actually in a crisis at the moment when it comes to social development. There isn't much that we can do at the moment. What's happening is that organs of state have stopped their procurement as much as they can, and some have requested exemption from our National Treasury from having to implement these rules. So it would actually be really useful for us to hear from the other countries what you are doing, what your statistics are like, because we are also in the process of a complete reform. Once again, in South Africa, our National Treasury again is writing a new public procurement bill. So it would be interesting to hear from the rest of you if there's anything that we as a country can use, because social procurement is it's almost, I'm hesitant to say, but I want to say it's at least as important as value for money in South Africa at the moment. So this is a huge crisis that we're having to deal with. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Claire.
All right. Thanks very much indeed, Alison. And I'm sure there are things that we can share with you as you start to relook at your procurement. We now have got Dr. James Rees from the University of Wolverhampton. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. I guess I'm in the enviable position of talking about the UK. Probably the audience is most familiar with that as a kind of case study of procurement and commissioning. So I'll try and, in that light, I'll try and keep my comments as brief as possible and allow as much time as possible for conversation if we get to that point. So I think firstly, I'd like to say that I think talking about procurement and commissioning in relation to the voluntary and community sector, social enterprise sector, is quite difficult because it depends very much on what perspective you're looking at it from. So I often liken thinking about commissioning and procurement to a kind of telescope, because it depends very much, how your view on commissioning depends very much on kind of which end of the telescope you're looking at. And there is a kind of real power dynamic between the different players on each side of that telescope. So typically, I guess the voluntary sector are very good at complaining about commissioning. They see it as a bad thing. They see it as mixed up in discourses of kind of competition, and see it as a bad thing. It's often posed as contrary to the kind of collaborative activity they want to engage with. At the same time, there's a kind of trade-off I think that's very clear between the interests of the voluntary and community sector, which I say often see themselves as a bit of a victim of commissioning, and the wider kind of system that obviously commissioners, procurement officials and kind of stewards of that system, if you like, are trying to achieve broader system outcomes and objectives. So again, as I say, the perspective on commissioning is very much what matters. And we can see that in debates over things like the work programme, for example. If you think about the work programme, which recently came to an end, from a voluntary sector perspective, it was seen as quite a bad thing. Didn't really work, didn't really engage them as well as it could have done, and commissioning was seen as part of the problem with that. Whereas from a kind of system perspective, from a national government perspective, it was seen as quite successful and met most of its outcomes. So again, it depends very much what part of the system you're really focusing on. And I would echo Gus's comments about the kind of national and local split within commissioning as well. I think that's a really important part of the dynamic in the UK. So we have commissioning at the national level, we have commissioning at the local level, and as we heard from Gus, a lot of the kind of activity is really happening at the local level, where interestingly as well, it's very difficult to get an overall picture of what's good and bad in those different parts. There's good practice and poorer practice in different parts of the session, in different parts of different localities across Britain. But thinking first about the national perspective, I think, commissioning within central government is quite important, because if nothing else, it kind of sets the tone for commissioning nationally. And I think, it's a kind of a leadership, a system leadership issue, really. if government can get this right at the central level, as it should, that kind of sets the tone for the country more broadly. And the picture, I'm afraid, is not a particularly good one, thinking particularly from a VCSE perspective. And it kind of, in a sense, this kind of gets under the bonnet rather of what Gus was talking about in the kind of broad picture that he set out. So to think, recently we've done some work with Clinks where we were looking particularly at the experience of probation reforms. The long run reforms called Transforming Rehabilitation, which has been a long running program. Lots of criticism of it, again, from the voluntary sector perspective. And we looked more recently at the recent reforms which build on that and are basically about further reforming probation system. And despite promises from national government that they would learn lessons from previous problems, yet again, we found that there have been huge problems engaging the voluntary community sector through procurement. They reported, labyrinthine systems to try and get onto the framework, seen as very commercial, very complex contracting, lots were too large. They described it as kind of Kafkaesque and really, really difficult to get involved in. And the real problem here is that it's often that, it's the larger organisations that do manage to get onto frameworks and do manage to get through procurement. And the real risk there is that we're losing to the system the kind of specialist expertise of what are often the smaller voluntary organisations. Not always, because some large organisations have that expertise as well. But we're losing very important specialist knowledge, thinking particularly around women's services in criminal justice, Black-led organisations, which the government says it wants to engage in these public service systems, and these are being lost from the system because they simply struggle to become commissioned. And interestingly, one of the things we saw within those probation reforms, there's actually central government and civil servants behind this in MOJ are able to actually flex the system to some degree. They are able to kind of tackle these very complex commissioning arrangements and improve things in certain circumstances. So we would recommend that they do think more about, if they do want to seriously engage VCSE organisations, they try and think about ways to improve commissioning. And again, just to reflect really quickly on the local government practice across the UK, very variable. There's a lot of good practice at local levels. We see, kind of local bottom-up agendas where sometimes VCSE organisations come together in kind of coalitions to improve commissioning. We've seen them devise commissioning frameworks that work better in places like Greater Manchester, where I'm based. Certainly that's happening in the West Midlands as well, where I work, in Wolverhampton. And I guess what they're really working on there is to build better commissioning that's based on more relational commissioning, where trust can build up. And again, trust is a hugely important part of making commissioning work, making procurement work. And this is all in the context where there isn't really any more the kind of capacity building efforts that are going into building the ability of voluntary organisations themselves to get better at responding to commissioning opportunities. And they just don't have the capacity to do that anymore. So just to finish really on some key messages, if I can. I mean, again, skimming over huge amounts of complexity here, just wanted to make some key points. Firstly, I would say it's really important that government, and I'm thinking particularly of central government here, don't raise unrealistic expectations. Try and put ideology in the backseat. Don't do big bang reorganisations where you're doing this transforming rehabilitation or transforming employment services. Think carefully about not raising expectations and be realistic about how you're going to engage the voluntary community sector, and actually probably get better outcomes from that. As part of that, proportionality is absolutely crucial. So commissioning that's not complex, overly bureaucratic, and where contract lots and contract sizes are appropriate to engaging the voluntary community sector. And again, I think that will really pay off. And just to stress as well that there is massive experience and expertise at the local level. Build on what's already there. Local authorities in many places are doing this already. They've got the local links, they've got the expertise, and they've got the local levels of trust in working with their own voluntary community sectors, where these are really important and complex ecosystems that they're working with. And again, they're being tasked with kind of stewarding those local ecosystems, and they really do have the expertise to be able to do that. So again, trust, relationality, and kind of bringing some stability to local systems is important, because it prevents kind of building up this bad will where voluntary organisations feel that they're kind of losing out to outside very often larger organizations. And I think that's really crucial to building trust into local systems. So I think that's enough for me. I really look forward to hopefully having a bit of time for discussion later on, and thank you for your contributions.
Thanks, James. Can I go quickly over now to Anthony Josie in the United States for your 5 minutes? Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I'll jump right in. The US government has, we characterize small businesses under 5 reporting categories. The small disadvantaged business category, which also includes the 8A, what we call the 8A Business Development Program. Then we have regular small businesses. Then we have the woman-owned small business program, and then the service-disabled veteran-owned small business program. And then we have the hub zone, which is more of an economically based program designed to stimulate economic growth in a particular area. Say, for instance, if an area was impacted by environmental pollution, they'll come in and they'll do remediation. They'll designate that as a hub zone. Then they'll attract businesses that come into that area and give them the designation as hub zone. In order to get any of those designations, you have to apply through the US Small Business Administration. Let me preface this because I've heard a lot of the demographics as it relates to race, Black, or whatever. None of the 5 categories that the US uses are awarded or given on the basis of race. It's all social economics. In 2021, the US total spend was $6.82 trillion. $145.7 billion went to small businesses in those categories. And that is prime contracts or subcontracting dollars, where a large business has been mandated to bring a small business along. The other thing I wanted to lift up is that we have designated or mandatory sources as well. All of our contracts are awarded based on market research. Every federal contracting officer must do market research. If it is determined that there are 2 capable small businesses that can perform that work, then by our federal acquisition guidelines, that work must be set aside for small businesses to compete. Now, if there are, say, 5 women-owned small businesses, 1 hub zone, and maybe 2 what we call small disadvantaged businesses, then we would make it a preference that it would go to the higher number, the woman-owned small businesses that we determine was capable. But the one thing that I did not hear today was market research. Everything is driven by market research. During COVID, the US government approved $4.6 trillion in the CARES Act. Small businesses played a great role in that. And that was to provide an economic stimulus to keep things going. How were they provided means in that effort? Say, for instance, we had what is called the PPP loan, and that, or the PPP program. And that particular program was designed to provide funding to small businesses who could not employ their workers because industries were on hold, restaurants shut down. A lot of nonprofits benefited from that. A great deal of that funding filtered down to the community level. The US awards monies to various states via block grants. Those monies filter down to the states filter them down to the counties filter them out to the cities. and we're still tabulating what the impact of all of that is down on a local level. But again, it was meant to stimulate various communities. I'm not saying we're doing a good job, but we're not doing a great job. There's still a lot of things that we could be doing well. Working for the State Department, we do work, OCONUS, in other countries. Some of the impact we have there, a lot of those large prime awardees, they don't want to use US designated firms. They'll use local labor, which works for a whole lot less money, and small US businesses are deprived. So I know my time is up, but I'm open for questions.
Fantastic. Claire, I think you're still muted.
Mute, sorry. Thanks very much, Anthony. I'm sorry we've eaten into time for questions, but Anne, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for a great panel, as always, action-packed and a bit pushed for time, but well done everybody for getting so much interesting stuff across in a short space of time. Please start thinking about the questions that you would like to ask. I see there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on in the chat. Just to get everyone in the mood for questions, we've got a quick contribution from Matt. I'll hand over to you first, and then from Sandra.
Thanks so much. And what an interesting discussion. It's my first one of these. It felt a bit like being at one of those restaurants when there's a kind of rotating wheel of different things to taste and all traveling very quickly. I'll try and kind of give some perspectives based on what's been discussed and also from my own experience and our organisation's experience. So I'm Matt, I'm Chief Development Officer at Catch-22. We are a major charity in England and Wales. So we're on James's list of people that are more successful than not in winning public sector tenders, including being the second largest by market share in the probation space after a private sector organisation. But we've been doing this on and off for about 250 years, and there are examples of appropriation of voluntary services by the state throughout history and reversals. And our own organisation was involved in delivery of probation services in the late 19th, early 20th century, just as it is today. So the Police Courts Mission, which was set up by Frederick Rainier, whose name adorned one of the charities that formed Catch-22 in 2008, was set up originally as a voluntary sector service. And this is kind of the journey of voluntary and government sector into the 19th and 20th century, whether it's schools or hospitals and so on. And one of my points is that I think public service delivery and public procurement intertwine, and public service can be pursued both inside and outside of government. Most of our income today is from public sector, so everything that Gus, Abby and James in particular were saying really chimes with our experience. I've dealt with hundreds of pre-qualification questionnaires, selection questionnaires, tenders over the last 3 years especially. And most of the stated intent is to engage VCSEs and SMEs. And this is palpably increasing on the back of the Social Value Act, which, as Claire said at the beginning, is now 10 years old. But public procurement is this means to the end rather than end in itself. And those stats from Gus at the beginning were very apposite. More than 160,000 registered charities, but the statutory income, whilst it accounts for about 60% of the sector's whole income, is reserved for about a quarter of the sector's kind of membership. So it's very much the preserve of a minority of VCSE organisations, and typically organisations that are either of a particular scale or, more importantly, a particular maturity because of the regulatory burden of bidding for public sector work, whether that's cybersecurity or environmental regulations or other kind of policies in the statute. I think the other point that's interesting, and maybe Abby was really wanting to chime on this, is the question about the role of VCSEs and why involve them. And this is something that's shifted over time, partly in line with public sentiment too. So public perception of what the state should provide or shouldn't provide, and how far that extends, and also the role it plays in broader stewardship of particular groups or particular kind of social purpose outcomes. My personal view is that no sector has a monopoly on good ideas And maximizing public value requires the public, the not-for-profit, the private sector to come together. And whilst regulation and legislation are kind of the signaling methods by which this is achieved, whether that's procurement regulations or things like legislative social value act, the reality is, and I think, James, you in particular mentioned relationships and trust. Collaboration truly travels with the speed of those, and we can only do worse than actually think about how to implement good practices in building these sort of relationships and collaborations, as opposed to how far the regulatory space takes us. And that's very much about building a good understanding of what each pillar brings, rather than valuing one over another, using the right procurement approaches, creating adequate space to be inclusive and collaborative, and driving quality. And of course, proportionality really matters too, not using really burdensome processes and so on. So I think a shared endeavour requires this curiosity about the proposition that each sector brings. And I think whilst we majored on some of the factors and the mechanisms by which procurement and commissioning happen, the most important part is probably a curiosity about the proposition that we can bring to solving some of the most pernicious challenges that we face.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt, for your input, and straight on to Sandra Hamilton.
Thank you. So I'm currently at the University of Manchester, but I'm going to speak first from a Canadian perspective. And I think what we've heard is very representative of how Canadians feel of being between Europe and the US. And so when you negotiate with the United States a free trade agreement and a NAFTA, going back to NAFTA, you're not going to get an agreement with the United States without a set aside for a small, medium businesses. It's a very important aspect of the negotiation, and we saw it in NAFTA, and we got very much used to that. But when Canada was negotiating with the European Union, there were no set asides for small businesses in these free trade agreements. So I think we have to recognize that, are we in fact valuing what matters? And if we want to bring more small enterprises, whether that's private sector or third sector VCSEs, are we designing procurement processes that are, easy and inviting? And I think we can all agree that we want them to be more simple. The British Columbia government, I think, in Canada has done a very good job of creating a short form RFP, and it's up for under 250,000 Canadian dollars. It's short out, short in, and I think it's very visible. It's a simplified process. There's a lot of terms and conditions in a link, but it does make it very easy to see very quickly what's the nature of the RFP required, and it makes it a very simple process to respond on those smaller contracts. My current research is in Greater Manchester, and I'm looking specifically at how our UK local governments, central government, national health, and universities responding to mandatory requirements to evaluate non-price social, environmental aspects. What does it feel like to be a procurer? We've heard a lot today about quantitative, but what's the qualitative? What does it really feel like? And I can say that from my extensive interviews, I'm just finishing off now, Greater Manchester has got tremendous knowledge and experience in running procurements with 20–30% weightings on non-financial outcomes. It's interesting to watch the NHS and the world's largest publicly funded health service come into this social value space. But of course, we're seeing here from Tussell, huge opportunity for the VCSE sector to be part of the solution in integrated care. And I love to hear words like collaboration, relationship, trust, because I think we have to start separating the conversation for people services from the purchase of widgets. And the system has often been built to drive down the cost of goods. And what we're actually now asking it to do is to increase the value for people, individuals, to address inequalities and to improve well-being in communities. Those are very different outcomes. So I think we need to change, be open to drastically change some of our systems, particularly as we embrace a new integrated care system. And anyone who reads anything that I write will probably come across my theory of priceless procurement. And I say, if we really want to build capacity, let's go to market with fixed price contracts in some areas and award on the basis of the social and environmental outcomes that we want to see. Let's move from being a price taker to a market shaper. So thank you very much for everybody's input. I really enjoyed hearing that today.
And thank you to you for those very pithy and insightful remarks. So we've got a tiny amount of time for questions. If you've got a question, please switch your camera on and wave at me, or raise a virtual hand. Might need some help from Andrea to spot those. Otherwise, I will abuse my position and ask a question myself. Which is, we've heard a little bit about sort of bureaucracy and barriers to VCSE participation. We haven't heard quite so much about upcoming reforms to procurement procedures in the UK. Do people think that that's an area that's going to make a difference, or are we really talking mostly about procurements that are too low value for that to matter?
Can I just jump in there, Anne, to defend the UK government somewhat as to the work that I've been in and my other colleagues on this, which is that, you know, obviously we've got the social enterprise framework that 10% of every contract coming out of government minimum has to have social value attached to it. Also is that we've been able now to ring fence contracts for VCSEs and SMEs. They're quite low, they're 120k at the moment for goods and services, and I think 4.2 million for construction. But also I think a lot of the delegates today talked about how do you get the sector tender ready, and so we've done a lot of work on contract readiness, and also, you know, we're going to be doing work on meet the buyers, because it's not only our government contracts, but the larger contracts that our strategic suppliers hold, that they also subcontract to the sector. But we have to make sure that the sector is ready for this. And also the diversity issue is having BAME, women and disability-led organisations. And I have 3 task forces that work on that within central government to make sure they are at the table also. Because everything we do will have an impact on our economy and on our communities up and down the country, which is so important. So, and the one last thing I would say, co-creation of contracts, again, is something that we've got to look at in order to make sure that they are fit for purpose, because we've had lots of contracts go on that really don't work for the service that they're trying to provide.
Fantastic, thank you, Claire. This is very much last call for questions now. If anybody's got something that they would like to put to our panel. I know there's a great discussion going on in the chat, which is pinging away continuously here. I think, yeah, getting to the end of our time possibly. So, Claire, are there any other final reflections that you would like to offer in closing up our session today?
Yeah, I think having this international perspective is so important, because we need to learn from each other. And I think one of the things we've been able to do, especially with the social enterprise sector, is that we've had conferences all around the world discussing. So I've been to South Africa, the States, etc. And we've learned from each other as a result of that. And I think that you know, these kind of forums are important for us all. So I think at the end of the day, we want markets that and goods and services that work for our communities. That's what it's down to. Somebody said whoever supplies them, but it is important that we have the people working on these, working in communities, to be very much part of the goods and services that we provide to our communities. So for me, that would be a key thing. But I've learned so much today, and I'm really so grateful to our speakers from around the world who've come in today to give us their insightful insight into what they're doing in their particular countries.
Fantastic. So thank you very much, everyone, for your input today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Claire for chairing the session. Thank you to our responders as well. And thanks to everybody who's been contributing in the chat. I see lots of positive feedback coming in through there as well, which is also lovely to see. And hopefully we will see you all again at our next session in May. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to POGO.
Thank you.
Thank you.